My wife and brother abandoned my sick baby, then used his name to run a 15-year donation scam. They called him a burden with a heartbeat while playing the grieving hero online. I kept him alive, saved every receipt, and said nothing. Then at their fundraiser, my son walked on stage, and they both went pale. My name is Luke. At the time all of this started, I was 31 years old, working freight dispatch for a mid-size logistics company, pulling in around $43,000 a year. Not glamorous, not exciting. I knew every truck route in a 4-state radius. I filed everything in triplicate, and I was home by 6 every night. I was the kind of man people describe as reliable when they're trying to say something nicer than boring. Sarah and I had been married 4 years. She was sharp and restless, and always a little dissatisfied with things, with the apartment, with the city, with the pace of a life built on consistency instead of excitement. I told myself that was just who she was. I told myself I could be enough. Keith was my younger brother. Notice I said was. Not because he's dead. Just because some relationships have an end date, and I know exactly when ours expired. Keith had the kind of charm that worked on everyone except the people who actually needed things from him. He borrowed money 8 times over 2 years, never the same amount twice, never repaid. I kept a small notebook in my desk drawer. $1,440 total. I wrote every entry in pen. That's the kind of man I am. I work in logistics, and in logistics, you document everything. I didn't know yet that habit would become the most important thing about me. The first time I found Keith's jacket on our coat rack on a Tuesday afternoon, no reason for him to be there. Sarah just ran into him. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that 3 more times over the next 2 months. I was very good at telling myself things. Lisa was Sarah's younger sister, and if Sarah was restless, Lisa was restless with an audience. She posted everything, every meal, every grievance, every cause she picked up and set down inside of a week. She had decided early on that I was boring, and she made sure Sarah heard that assessment regularly. Luke's too practical. Luke doesn't dream big enough. Luke's just so steady. She said it like steady was a personality flaw. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, is that Lisa had already launched a Facebook fundraiser page called Prayers for Mason 2 full weeks before Sarah told me she was leaving. 2 weeks. The campaign was already running. The donations were already coming in. And I didn't even know there was a plan yet. I came home on a Thursday to a quiet house. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind where you notice the coat rack is lighter than usual, and the air feels different, and your brain starts doing math before your heart is ready for the answer. Sarah's side of the closet was empty. Her toiletries were gone. Keith's truck had not been on the street for 2 days. I'd noticed, but filed it under not yet. The way you do when you already know something and aren't ready to know it. On the kitchen table there was a handwritten note. 1 page. She'd used the good pen, the one I kept by the phone charger. I remember thinking that was a strange detail to notice. I noticed it anyway. I won't read you the whole thing. But there was one sentence I have memorized, word for word, 15 years later. She wrote that Mason was too sick to have a real future, and that she and Keith needed to start over somewhere that isn't this. That was the whole explanation. 11 words to account for a marriage, a child, and whatever it was she thought we were building together. Mason was upstairs, 18 months old. I went up and found him in his crib, not crying, not fussing, just lying there with these enormous, quiet eyes staring at the ceiling. He looked at me when I walked in. He didn't reach up the way babies do. He just looked. He weighed 19 pounds. I know that because I'd been to his last pediatric appointment. The healthy range for his age was 22 to 24. He hadn't gained weight in 4 months. I hadn't known that was a symptom of something other than a disease. I picked him up. He didn't make a sound. He just settled against my chest like he was too tired to do anything else, and I stood there in that room understanding that I was the only person left in this building who was going to make sure he was okay. That was the moment. Not Sarah's note. Not the empty closet. That moment, in that room, holding 19 pounds of quiet. I called the pediatrician first thing the next morning. Doctor. Michelle Evans had been Mason's doctor since birth. She knew his history, knew the prior diagnosis of failure to thrive with a suspected metabolic disorder, the clinical language that Sarah had always cited when anyone asked how serious it was. Serious enough to leave, apparently. Serious enough to walk away from. Dr. Evans ran a full workup. Blood panels, weight assessment, developmental screening. She called me into her office afterward and set the chart down on the desk between us. She told me that Mason was severely malnourished, not due to any detected metabolic disease, not because of some inherited condition that science hadn't caught up to yet, because he had not been receiving adequate nutrition or consistent care for an extended period. His iron was low, his vitamin D was deficient, his weight was in the 3rd percentile, and the metabolic disorder previously cited? No clinical evidence. None. She put all of it in writing. I folded the report, put it in my jacket pocket, and drove home with Mason asleep in his car seat. I did not cry until I was parked in the driveway with the engine off. Dr. Evans had looked at me over that chart and said, very quietly, this child was not dying of a disease. He was dying of being left alone. That sentence has lived in me for 15 years. And it wasn't the worst thing I learned that week, it was just the first receipt. I want to tell you that the first few months were hard but manageable. I want to tell you I had a system, a support network, a plan. I had none of those things. What I had was a malnourished 18-month-old, a freight dispatch schedule that assumed I had a co-parent, and a neighborhood full of people who had already heard Sarah's version of events. The look started almost immediately. The neighbor across the hall, who used to say good morning now, just nodded and moved on faster than necessary. A woman from the building next door stopped me in the parking lot one afternoon to ask, very carefully, if I was doing okay. She meant well. But the question underneath the question was, what did you do to make her leave? I didn't answer the part she wasn't saying out loud. I just told her Mason had a pediatric appointment on Thursday and I needed to get him fed first. I restructured my dispatch shifts today only within the first 2 weeks. That cost me $280 a month in differential pay. I didn't mention it to anyone because there was no one to mention it to. And also because it wasn't a sacrifice, it was just math. Mason needed someone home by 6. I got home by 6. That's logistics. I found a used parenting handbook at the Goodwill 2 blocks from the apartment. $3. It was water-stained on the cover, and someone had highlighted random passages in yellow, none of which made any sense out of context. I wrote Mason start here on the inside cover and read the whole thing in 4 nights after he went to sleep. I followed it like a work manual. When it didn't have the answer, I called Dr. Evans. She always picked up. My mother called that Thursday the same week I'd restructured my shifts, the same week I'd bought the handbook to ask if I thought maybe Sarah had her reasons for leaving. I told her yes, Mom, she did. She just didn't bother to share them with me. There was a long pause. Then she changed the subject. I didn't bring it up again. What made it worse quietly, steadily worse, was Lisa's page. Prayers for Mason was still running, still posting. The updates had shifted from vague medical language to soft, sorrowful captions about little Mason's difficult journey and continuing to pray for our fighter. People were still sharing it. People were still donating. And every person who donated was operating on the understanding that Mason was critically ill, that his situation was tragic, and that the people who had walked away from him were somehow still the ones carrying the weight. I watched this happen from the outside and said nothing, because what exactly was I supposed to say? I had a logistics job, a $3 handbook, and a baby who was starting slowly, weekly, measurably to get better. And he was getting better. That part I need you to hear clearly. By Mason's 2nd birthday, he weighed 26 pounds. Dr. Evans had been seeing us every month, filing notes, tracking his development. At the 8-month mark, she wrote in her report, remarkable recovery, child thriving under present care arrangement. I put that note in the manila folder with the first one. The folder was getting thicker. I wasn't doing that on purpose. It was just what you do when you work in logistics, you keep the paperwork. That same week, Lisa posted a photo of a candle on her page. The caption read, still praying for our little fighter. Mason had just finished his 3rd plate of pasta and was asleep on the couch with sauce on his chin. I looked at that post for a long time. Then I closed the app, put the phone face down on the counter, and went to wash the dishes. 15 years is a long time to summarize. But some things stand out the way certain details always do, sharp and specific, the kind you don't choose to remember, they just stay. Mason's first day of kindergarten, September, backpack nearly as big as he was. Grinning like the world had just opened a door specifically for him. His first soccer goal at age 9, he didn't celebrate the way the other kids did, just turned around and looked for me in the bleachers first, like he needed to confirm I'd seen it. A junior year report card with a 3.7 gigapascals that I kept in the manila folder alongside Dr. Evans' medical files, not because I planned to use it for anything, just because that's where I kept things that mattered. A night in a school parking lot after a track meet when Mason was 14, sitting on the hood of my car eating gas station sandwiches, and he said not dramatically, not like he'd rehearsed it, just stated it the way you'd state something obvious. "You're the only dad I've ever needed." I didn't say anything back. I handed him the other half of my sandwich, and we sat there in the dark for a while. At 11 years old, Mason started writing my last name on school enrollment forms. Not because I'd legally adopted him, I hadn't. The paperwork had always been complicated, and frankly neither of us had pushed for it. He just filled in the blank the way he saw it. The school called once to clarify. I told them it wasn't a mistake. They updated the file. I found out through mutual friends that Sarah and Keith had moved back to the county 3 months earlier. I found this out the same week Mason received his college acceptance letter. I remember looking at both pieces of information, one on my phone, one on a sheet of paper on the kitchen counter, and feeling something I can only describe as the universe having decent timing for once. 2 weeks after that, an envelope arrived on a Tuesday evening. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note from a former coworker of Keith's that said, simply, "Thought you should know." Underneath it was a private investigator's report, professionally compiled, dated, thorough. It documented that Sarah had been conducting a sustained affair with a man named Daniel for at least 3 years, and more specifically, that she had been transferring money from a joint account she shared with Keith directly into Daniel's account. $14,000 across 31 months. Transaction screenshots included. Account names clearly visible. I want to be precise about something. I did not arrange this. I did not hire anyone. I did not go looking for it. It arrived on a Tuesday, and I read it once, standing at my kitchen counter, and then I placed it in the drawer next to Dr. Evans' reports, Mason's old school photos, and the $3 parenting handbook. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text anyone. I didn't do anything except close the drawer. I wasn't planning revenge. I want to be very clear about that. I was just a man in logistics who had stopped throwing things away. The folder had become something substantial by then. I still didn't have a plan for it. I just knew that documentation has a way of being useful at exactly the moment someone decides to rewrite history. There came an evening when I spread everything on the kitchen table. Mason was at track practice. I had about 90 minutes. I opened the drawer, took out the manila folder, and laid it all out in order, not because I had a plan, but because I needed to see it the way you sometimes need to see the full scope of a thing before you can decide what it means. Sarah's note first. 1 page, her handwriting, the good pen. Too sick to have a real future. 11 words that were supposed to be the last chapter. Then Dr. Evans' full medical file, 18 months of appointments, the initial findings, the malnourishment diagnosis, the monthly recovery notes, the 8-month notation that Mason was thriving under present care arrangement, words written by a doctor, on clinic letterhead, dated and signed. Then the PI report. $14,000. 31 months. A man named Daniel whose name appeared in transaction notes that Keith had presumably never thought to check. And finally, the screenshots. Lisa's prayers for Mason page. I had been collecting them quietly for years, saved to a folder on my phone labeled, simply, FYI. Donation requests. Candle photos. Captions about little Mason's difficult journey. And underneath each post, a timestamp. I pulled up Dr. Evans' recovery chart on my phone and placed it side by side with Lisa's posts. The last prayers for Mason update was dated 3 days after Evans had written child thriving. The donations had kept coming in for another 11 days after that. I photographed every document, organized the phone folder. Then I put everything back in the manila envelope, returned it to the drawer, and started dinner. I wasn't building a case. I was just a man who understood that betrayal leaves paperwork, and paperwork doesn't expire. Mason came home that night smelling like the track and wanting pasta. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table where the folder had been spread out an hour earlier, and halfway through dinner he looked up and asked, very carefully, the way teenagers ask things they've been rehearsing in their heads, "Was my biological mom the one who left me?" I put my fork down. I told him yes. I told him that she left, that my brother Keith left with her, that he hadn't been well when they left, and that I chose to stay. I didn't call her a bad person. I didn't editorialize. I just told him the shape of what happened and let him hold it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Did she think I was going to die?" I said, "She told herself that. I don't think she looked hard enough to know the difference." He nodded slowly, the way he does when he's filing something away rather than reacting to it. Then he asked if he could have more pasta. I gave him the rest of mine. We were almost done eating when he said it, not dramatically, not as a declaration, just the way you'd state something you'd known for a long time and finally found the right words for. You're not my dad by blood, but you became one anyway. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at this kid 15 years old, healthy, whole, sitting at my kitchen table eating pasta, and I thought about 19 pounds and a quiet crib and a $3 handbook and every Tuesday night grocery run for 15 years. Yeah, I said. I guess I did. He asked if I would ever want him to meet them someday. I told him that choice was entirely his, whenever and however he decided. He nodded again. He stacked his plate on top of mine and took them both to the sink. That was the last we spoke of it for a while. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what happened next, because I think it matters. I spent 15 years not calling anyone, not showing up anywhere, not sending a single message to Sarah or Keith or Lisa. Not once. I had the folder. I had the phone folder. I had everything I needed to make a very uncomfortable case to a very wide audience. And I chose, repeatedly, to close the drawer instead. I was fine with that choice. I had Mason, I had my job, I had a life that worked. The people who had burned things down were living somewhere on the other side of the county, and I genuinely did not spend my mornings thinking about them. That part is true. I need you to believe that part. But something had shifted since I found out they'd moved back. Not inside me, I hadn't changed. What had shifted was the air around Mason. He was starting to hear things. It started small. A comment from a kid at school whose parents apparently still ran in the same circles as Sarah and Keith. Then another one. A week later. Different kid, same basic shape. The story being circulated, and I use that word deliberately, because stories don't circulate by accident, was that Luke had been difficult. That Luke had been so intent on keeping Mason to himself that he'd prevented the boy from getting proper medical treatment. That Keith and Sarah had tried to stay involved, and Luke had shut them out. That the whole situation was really more complicated than it looked. I heard the full version of this narrative on a Wednesday afternoon, when Mason came home from school and sat down at the kitchen table with the specific kind of careful calm that means a teenager has been thinking about how to say something for most of the day. "Dad," he said, "someone told me you refused to let me get real medical care when I was little. That you kept me away from doctors on purpose." I didn't say anything immediately. I got up, went to the drawer, and took out the manila folder. I found Dr. Evans' first report, the original, dated when Mason was 18 months old, her name and credentials on the clinic letterhead, and I placed it on the table in front of him. I didn't explain it. I just let him read. He read the first paragraph. He read the word malnourished. He read Dr. Evans' clinical finding that there was no evidence of the metabolic disorder previously cited. He read the phrase, inadequate nutrition and insufficient care over an extended period. He put the report down. He looked at it for a moment. Then, he looked at me. He didn't ask any follow-up questions. Not because he didn't understand it, because he understood it completely. I put the report back in the folder and returned it to the drawer. We ordered pizza that night and watched something forgettable on television and didn't talk about it again. But I stopped avoiding the idea of a conversation. Not planning one. Not arranging one. Just if it came, I would no longer be the one crossing the street to prevent it. I didn't plan a confrontation, but I stopped actively avoiding one. So, back to the dairy aisle. I had a carton of Horizon whole milk in my hand. I always buy milk now. I have bought it from this same store every Tuesday for 15 years, and if you've been paying attention, you already know why. It started the week I brought Mason home from Dr. Evans' office with a folder full of paperwork and a plan that consisted entirely of feeding a child until he didn't look like he was disappearing anymore. Milk was the first thing on the list. It has been on the list every week since. Sarah saw me before Keith did. She looked up from his phone screen, registered my face, and smiled. Not a complicated smile. Not the smile of a woman surprised to encounter the consequences of her choices in the dairy section of a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. Just a smile. Easy. Unbothered. The smile of someone who has been telling a story about you for 15 years and just watched the subject of that story walk himself into the room. "Luke," she said, "you're still here. Still the same." She meant it as an observation. It landed like a verdict. Keith put his arm around her, the same easy gesture, the same performance of a couple who have nothing to account for. Lisa was one step behind them with her phone up in portrait mode, thumb hovering. She records everything. Some habits don't change. I looked at Keith. I said, How's Daniel? 3 words. That was all. Keith's smile didn't fall. It collapsed. Not gradually, not with dignity. It just went. Sarah's hand moved to her phone the way a person reaches for something they've already lost. Lisa's thumb went still. The fluorescent light hummed. I was still holding the milk carton. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move. I just watched the 3 of them recalibrate in real time, and I thought, 15 years of documentation, and it cost me 3 words. Keith said he wanted to talk. I told him I had time. We left the carts where they were and walked 1 block to a corner cafe. The kind of place with bad lighting and good coffee and 6 occupied tables, full of people who had nowhere better to be on a Tuesday afternoon. We took a booth in the back. Sarah slid in across from me. Keith sat beside her. Lisa took the end, phone still in her hand, still recording. I noticed that. I filed it. Keith opened the way people like Keith always open, from the position of the reasonable one. He said I'd been holding on to a grudge for 15 years. He said my inability to move on had hurt everyone, including Mason. He said Mason would have had a real family if I hadn't made it so difficult. Sarah nodded along, adding that Mason would have been fine with us eventually, that the situation had been more complicated than I ever gave them credit for. I let them finish. Then I picked up my phone, opened the FYI folder, and slid it across the table to Keith. The first image on screen was the PI report, specifically the page listing the bank transfer records. $14,000 across 31 months. Sarah's account name at the top. A man named Daniel in the transaction notes. Keith stared at it. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched him look at Sarah. I watched Sarah look at the table. I scrolled to the next document without a word. Dr. Evans' first medical report. Clinic letterhead. Mason's name. The word malnourished in the opening paragraph. The clinical finding of no detected metabolic disorder. The phrase inadequate nutrition and insufficient care. I left the phone on the table between us and sat back. The waitress nearby had stopped pretending to wipe down the counter. The man at the table to our left had set his newspaper down. Nobody said anything for a long moment. I've had 15 years to organize this, I said. You had 15 years to come up with a better story. Lisa still had her phone out. That's when I remembered she'd been recording since the grocery store. I looked at Lisa directly for the first time since we'd sat down. I asked her, very calmly, whether the recording had started before or after I said Daniel's name. She didn't answer. I picked my phone back up, navigated to the screenshot folder, and found what I was looking for: Lisa's last prayers for Mason post, with its timestamp, placed on screen next to the corresponding page of Dr. Evans' recovery chart covering the same date range. Lisa's final fundraiser post was dated 3 days after Evans had written child thriving under present care arrangement. The donations had continued for 11 days after that. The numbers were there. The dates were there. The account name on the fundraiser was there. I didn't say anything about it. I didn't need to. The booth was very quiet. Lisa put her phone face down on the table. Then the door opened. Mason had texted me 20 minutes earlier to say he'd swing by and pick me up after my grocery run. I'd mentioned it that morning at breakfast. He walked in, still in his track jacket, looked around the cafe, and found our booth. He stopped. He looked at Sarah for what I can only assume was the first time in his conscious memory. She looked back at him. Whatever she had imagined this moment would look like, I don't think it looked like this. A 15-year-old standing in a cafe doorway, healthy and whole and entirely at ease with who he was. No confusion on his face. No longing. Just recognition and the measured calm of someone who already knows the full story and made his peace with it a long time ago. He walked to the booth. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't say a word to Sarah or Keith or Lisa. He just stopped at the end of the table and placed his hand briefly on my shoulder, one quiet, certain gesture, and then stood there, healthy, whole, 15 years old. He was the receipt they couldn't argue with. Here is what happened after. Keith confronted Sarah about Daniel within the week. I know this because 3 separate people told me, unsolicited, over the course of about 10 days, the kind of people who were never going to call me directly but couldn't quite help mentioning it when they ran into me at the gas station or the hardware store. The confrontation was apparently loud enough that mutual acquaintances heard it through an apartment wall. He filed for separation 2 weeks after the cafe. I did not feel satisfaction about that. I felt nothing in particular. It was just a thing that happened, the way consequences tend to happen when paperwork finally catches up to the people who forgot they left it behind. Lisa's prayers for Mason page was deleted within 48 hours of the cafe. Not quietly enough, though. 3 people had already screenshotted it and shared it to a local community group before it disappeared. I didn't do that either. I want to be clear about that. I just stopped throwing things away. Other people did the rest. Sarah called me once. I saw her name on the screen. I let it ring out. I deleted the contact. That was the entire conversation. The milk carton is sitting on my kitchen counter right now as I tell you this. Horizon whole milk, half gallon, same brand, same store. I bought it Tuesday. I put it in the refrigerator. I took it out this morning. Life continued exactly as it has for 15 years. Groceries bought, meals made, a boy kept fed and whole and moving forward. Nothing about that changed. Nothing about that was ever going to change. A few weeks after the cafe, I was cleaning out the hall closet and found the parenting handbook behind a stack of boxes. Water-stained cover, random yellow highlights, $3 from the Goodwill 2 blocks over. I brought it out and handed it to Mason without explanation. He opened it, read the inscription on the inside cover, Mason start here, and looked up at me. He kept it. He put it on his shelf, right next to his track trophies. I looked at that shelf for a long time. He wasn't my son by blood, but he became my son by every choice that actually counts. And that all of that, every Tuesday, every folder, every document I kept without knowing why. That is what karma actually looks like. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a 15-year-old kid putting a $3 handbook on a shelf like it belongs there. Because it does.